So as I begin my 6th year of living here in this state, I'm beginning to believe that I have become Floridified. Consider, if you would, Exhibit A. I have been really cold this last week. On Tuesday, I think I wore 3 layers to work. Exhibit B is any time that I hear a newscaster start off by saying, "And now another strange story," I think to myself, please don't let it be from Florida. Please don't let it be from Florida. That particular prayer is not answered very often because usually the famous Florida man has mistaken a bank drive-through for a Taco Bell. Exhibit C, my favorite story from this last year, was a guest, a visitor to our beloved state, walked into the Airbnb that they had rented and began to look around, and they went outside to the pool, to the lanai area, and there in the pool was an alligator. Now wait for it, because that's not that unusual. We usually just call that Wednesday down here. What is amazing is that this particular alligator at that particular Airbnb in that pool had somehow or another managed to get itself up on an alligator-shaped floaty. Best news story ever. And I take some solace in the fact that it isn't just Florida where strange stories occur. Maybe over the holidays you read about this family up in Michigan that has been passing down a fruitcake from generation to generation to generation. That fruitcake is now 141 years old. And when I read that story, immediately I thought, well, I guess my family's not so strange. And I immediately lost my appetite. It's good. It's good for you and I to hold on to some of the strange, some of the peculiar, some of the unusual that happens in this world that we inhabit at this time, to hold on to that as we step into this somewhat strange story that Mark is inviting us into. To hold on to some of the peculiar ways that God moves even in the strange parts of life. Because I think what Mark is up to is not necessarily being a reporter of just facts and figures. I think part of what Mark is inviting us into today is a parable. A parable that is rich to overflowing with metaphors. A parable that might teach and tell us what this human life might be all about. The question for us to ponder, to hold close today, is not how in the world is any of this true, but rather how. How might this story be true? And it can start from that very first sentence of the story we just told to one another, the very first words that said Jesus and the disciples were crossing over. Jesus and his disciples were leaving Capernaum, what was familiar, what had been home for them, what they knew, where Jesus had preached and taught and healed people. They leave behind that and venture to the unknown, the brand new, the different and distinctive. 26 days into a brand new year, into a brand new decade, where are you crossing over? Where have you tried to leave behind what was known and familiar for what was unknown and unfamiliar? Where are you crossing over? Maybe trying into a new mind, way of thinking, a new way of living, a new way of being. Maybe like me, you're continually trying to process some of the pain in your life so that when we cross over into February at the end of this week, there might be a newness that greets us as we turn that calendar page. That metaphor of crossing over. And as you're holding that close, it's important to realize that Jesus and the disciples crossed over using a boat. So often in Scripture, water is a symbol for what's chaotic, what churns and turns restless within us. If we hold deeper on that metaphor of crossing over, it isn't always easy. Sometimes when we try to change, when we try to move from one place to another place, this vessel that's called our life can feel like it's being tossed to and fro. Sometimes when we try to let go of one way of being, other people try to cling to it and tell us not to go to that new place. But also know this, that crossing over, it doesn't always have to be tumultuous. It doesn't always have to toss and turn our lives upside down. Sometimes crossing over can fill us with joy. I think about the Carrie Newcomer concert just last week, how the sanctuary is still reverberating with the soothing sound of her voice that ministered to our souls. I think about our leadership retreat last Saturday as we cross over and new leaders begin to step up and guide us in the days and year to come. That there was a sweet, sweet spirit in Seister Hall last Saturday. Or I think about our worship last Sunday as Betty Smith and Dr. Marcia Kindle Smith and Felix McElroy all led us in such a beautiful and profound praise of God. We crossed over last Sunday into that promise and possibility of God. So where does that metaphor of crossing over connect and intersect, speak and sing to your life in such a time as this? You know, no sooner had Jesus crossed over, had he stepped out of the ship that had carried him and his disciples, no sooner had his foot sunk into the sandy beach on which he stepped upon, then all of a sudden, the story starts to unfold in peculiar and odd ways. We hear about this man who howls at the top of his lungs. This beloved child of God. Beloved child of God who had been shackled and chained, but had broke through those. This beloved child of God who hurt and harmed himself with the stones that were nearby. This beloved child of God whose mailing address was a graveyard. I think part of what Mark is inviting us into is the truth that there is a shadow side to every single one of our lives. A shadow side that oftentimes we don't want to talk about, we don't want to deal with, we don't want to think about. That shadow side in your life, in my life. And I think part of it is that it exists not only individually but collectively. The shadow side of this world in which we inhabit right now. The statistics tell us that 17 million adults suffer from depression. 17 million. And of that 17 million number, 7 million are over the age of 65. I've heard that story. I've heard it from people here who talk about the broken promises of the so-called golden years. I hear it from folks who are caregivers. The stress and strain of caring for a partner or a spouse as they age. The stress and strain physically, emotionally, spiritually. Trying to raise children in the world today with the technology all around us and the constant staring at our phones that distract us. This world in which we live where adulting can be hard and difficult. And it's not just for us. We know that suicide rates among teenagers are the highest they've been in decades. That shadow side of life. And maybe like the townspeople, we just want to push some of those statistics and numbers to the fringe and fray. We'd rather push them to the peripheral of our lives so that maybe we don't have to deal with it so much. Maybe like the townspeople, we just don't know what to do, and so we sort of clog our ears. Or maybe we're more like the disciples. Did you notice that when the disciples step off the boat, when the disciples' feet sink into the sand of the shore right alongside Jesus, all of a sudden they move to the sidelines. They fade out of the story. They're no longer even part of what unfolds in the narrative today. And I get that. Sometimes I wonder, what can I do? What can I do to help heal and provide hope in this world? What can I do for those who are struggling deep in their souls, whether it be with depression or facing mental illness or physical ailments or grief? How can I help? There are moments I feel like the disciples standing on the sidelines silently, wondering if my presence or words would really help. But then Notice in the story that it's the man, this beloved child of God who was tormented by demons. He finds his voice. He cries out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of God?" Once again, Mark is reminding us in his gospel that it's often those on the fringe and the fray who get it first. That it's often those who we've pushed to the very edges who are the first to confess that Jesus is the Christ. It's not the disciples. It's not the religious folks. It's not those who are supposedly in the know who worship Jesus first. It's this man. It's this beloved Son of God who comes before Jesus and asks to be made whole. That question for you and for me, to bring our wants, to bring our wounds into the sanctuary today, to open our whole lives to the healing presence of God here and now in our lives. We're told that this beloved child of God, as he's worshiping Jesus, asked for the demons to be sent into a herd of pigs that are on the countryside nearby. Now, as an Iowan, somebody who grew up among folk whose uniform are overalls and John Deere caps, it is my obligation to tell you, pigs can swim. Suddenly, everybody's thinking about a pig doing the backstroke. But again, part of what I think Mark is getting at here, that how is this true? That we, you and I, would be willing, would be vulnerable enough to share that which is deepest within us. Those wounds and those wants that reside within each of our hearts and our lives. And that this might be such a place where that kind of sharing could happen. So where? Where do you find yourself entering in the story today? Where's the doorway that you connect with the most? Maybe that metaphor of crossing over is just roaming around and you want to spend some more time this week with that. Or maybe it's the disciples and the townsfolk you're connecting with, wondering how can you reach out to those who are hurting and need to be heard in our world. Or maybe it's the beloved Son of God wanting to have God's presence, God's love, God's grace wrap around you in healing and heartfelt ways. However you find yourself connecting with the story today, continue to hold on to this. Because today I celebrate on this, our annual meeting Sunday, I celebrate the 65 years this congregation has been a lighthouse to the Sarasota community. And I celebrate today, as we turn 66, that we're not anywhere close to retiring. Our church remains vital and vibrant. In just a few weeks, we will be dedicating and blessing our Oasis Center for Renewal and Reflection. Greg and I are continuing to work on worship that is meaningful, that helps you connect to God's presence. We're continuing to talk about how. How can this community of faith be a place of healing, a source of strength in such a time as this? How can we as people of faith provide a space where the sharp shards of life that still wound us can be brought out into the light? How might we reach out beyond our walls? Continue to reach out in serving the community meal, attending the Sure Rally and the Nehemiah Action in a few weeks to be part of the relaunch of Family Promise. That in the coming months, we'll bless Greg to go on an amazing sabbatical this summer. Along the way, that we might laugh together, cry together, support one another, share with one another, sing with one another. In short, be the church together. That's the invitation. That's the invitation as we enter our 66th year of ministry. And when somebody says to you, "You go to church? You give up a Sunday morning to sit and listen to someone talk to you for over 15 minutes? That seems kind of strange." May you and I know that we worship a God who loves the strange, who loves the peculiar, who works through the weird in our lives, in you and in me. Thank you for the ways you continue to be the church at such a time as this. And thank you for the privilege of being your pastor. Amen.